that, I am so happy to introduce our morning keynote, Natalie S. Burke, a nationally known speaker known as an equity evangelist, strategist, master facilitator, and public health leader. Natalie S. Burke provides executive leadership for Commonwealth Action, whose mission is to develop people and organizations to produce health through equitable policies, programs, and practices. Since the mid-1990s, Natalie has focused on creating opportunities for health through community, institutional, systemic, and policy change. Since 2016, Natalie served as co-director for the Culture of Health Leaders National Program Center, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She directs the Kaiser Permanente Institute for Equitable Leadership in Baltimore, and she's a member of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement's Equity Advisory Group. Throughout her career, Natalie has sought to understand the interaction among genetics, personal health behaviors, and the systems and institutions that provide the context within which we live our lives and make our decisions. That understanding guides her work to orchestrate constructive discomfort that is necessary to create positive change. To alter our collective health destiny, Natalie believes we must change our language, challenge deeply held beliefs about equity in our society, and accept the role we each play in the production of the public's health. She asks each of us to get uncomfortable. Are y'all ready? Yes, let's give Natalie S. Burke a hand as she comes up, our morning keynote.
So it's really interesting. Yesterday when I was in here and I was listening to you all, and as I've gotten to speak to some of you individually, there's a comfort that I felt in connecting with you and the work that you're doing. Because this is my space and you all are my people, whether you realize it or not. So Commonwealth Action's work takes us around the country to work in communities in very deep and meaningful ways, sometimes for long periods of time. So there are communities with whom we've worked for 7, 10 years at a time, doing the type of systems change work that you all are doing. And in that, we've done a lot of work around building capacity and really as a technical assistance provider and a partner. And interestingly enough, I was looking at the outcomes of your needs assessment and the interest that you have in sustainability, in community engagement, and in systems change. And all of that is really right up my alley. So before I get started, there were, I'll call them nuggets that I wanted to share with you in those areas before I get in the presentation. So the first is about sustainability. And what I'll say is years ago, I met a very wise woman who prefers that I not say I'm quoting her. But one of the things that she talks about in working with communities, that if you want to do this change-focused work, particularly around equity, it is critical that the work be visible immediately. Because visibility leads to credibility, and credibility leads to sustainability. A lot of times when we have this conversation about sustainability, we become fixated on what we perceive to be resources, right? So often it's the dollars, the leadership, and a lot of other things that take up a lot of space when we start talking about sustainability. But here's what we've learned over time. If you start on this equity journey and you don't communicate coming out the gate, people will automatically perceive it as a threat. And in the absence of communication, people communicate. There is a space that you are not filling, and someone will fill that space on your behalf. So even though things may not be perfect, please do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So a lot of times organizations will say, well, we don't have our stuff together. Our hiring policies, our internal cultures, things are not equitable here, so how can we go out in the world and claim equity as our work? That's exactly why you should do it. You need to demonstrate that you're doing the work and that this challenge is real and that you're willing to be transparent in sharing the challenges that are around it. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay? The next piece, and I'll talk about this a little bit more around community engagement. The way that we talk about community is all wrong. And so I just want you to keep that in your head, and I'm going to get very specific about it later on. But we have set up an us and them dynamic, and there's some tough questions that we need to ask ourselves if we truly hope to change systems and institutions, right? So I'm going to circle back on a community piece. So sustainability, community engagement, and then systems change. When we do systems change work in communities and we say, oh, we need community engagement, we're doing work that is at 50,000 feet. And we want people who are living on the ground to connect to that work. This is not short-term work, it's long-term work. That's part of what makes it so difficult. Part of what I want to encourage you to do is to operate on parallel tracks. So while you're looking at 50,000 feet at policy, institutional, and systems change, you have got to incorporate and build in short-term, tangible wins that people in communities that you are trying to engage can connect with in a real and meaningful way. Part of the reason that I talk about this, and I'll say it comes from a place of frustration. When funders come in and they say they want you to go upstream and look at that 20,000, 50,000 foot view, but you're working in a community that, if you were to look at Maslow's hierarchy, is dealing with things around basic human needs, it feels very disrespectful and lacking in humanity. So how am I asking community to engage when people are worried about being safe? How am I asking community to engage in changing policy when they're hungry coming to the community meeting? It's unacceptable, it's disrespectful, it's inequitable, and it is unjust. And so in that, what I encourage you to do is to think about and orchestrate the parallel track. So while you're dealing with the upstream things, which are very important, make sure that in some way, shape, or form, in a way that's authentic and meaningful to the community, that you address those needs that are closest to them. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, now I'm off my soapbox for that. About to get onto another soapbox. All right. So, one of the things that I think is really important, the shirt is not just a gimmick. I mean this, right? I want you to get uncomfortable. And part of my job with you today is to orchestrate some constructive discomfort. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to be open enough to settle into it. Don't run from it. Don't run from it intellectually, and don't run from it emotionally. All right? So just stick with me and trust me that we'll move through it. And you'll have an opportunity then to begin to apply it when we get into the interactive session. So we have a lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to provide some context for where we are as a country. We're going to talk a lot about common language, and there's a bridge that we're building, and we need to talk about that bridge. We're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and health equity. P&O is privilege and oppression, and that's really, really important to the framing that I'm going to provide. We'll talk about social identities. We don't talk about them in that way, but it's how we've organized our entire society is around social identities. We're going to talk about the equity lens and then leadership, because that's about you. So what to expect? This idea of being uncomfortable. I'm going to challenge some of your assumptions. I might help to affirm some things that you suspect are true. And in that, all of it may make you feel like your shoulders want to creep up by your ears, and I'm going to ask you to drop your shoulders. All right? So the first thing that I want to say, and people will tell you I'm pretty big when it comes to this whole thing about language. Your health is not an accident, it's a production of society. I know you all know this because you work on social determinants of health. But part of the reason that I talk about it in this way is if you're working on the social determinants of health, you have to be able to speak to people who work in other sectors and in other disciplines. Talking about health as a production seems to resonate for folks who we would often consider out of sector. Okay, so the way that I talk about it is to say, your health is not an accident, it's a production of society. It's approximately 10 to 20% genetic, 30 to 40% based on your personal behavioral choices. Do you eat right, diet, exercise, engage in risky behaviors, wear a seatbelt, wear a condom, wash your hands, in no particular order. And the last 40 to 50% is about systems and institutions that create the context and the construct within which we live our lives and make our decisions. When I explain that in that way, oddly enough, it clicks for folks. People in education, people in housing, in transportation. I went into a Fortune 150 corporate boardroom, and they got it. Because what I was trying to talk to them about was what was their role in the production of health, right? So the question is, if health is a production, what are we producing? Well, they say that infant mortality is a big marker of a country, about how we're doing. So when we look at infant mortality and we break that down by race in particular, it's telling us something, and we need to listen. Then, if you were to look at the death rate for infants in Colorado, and you break that down by race, and you look and you see that for Black African American babies, you're talking about 11.7 out of 1,000. And then you're looking at white counterparts at 4.8. Now, while all of it seems to be dropping over time, the inequity is still very present. So the question is, how are we doing? Well, when I go into communities and I talk with folks, especially people who live in communities where they have high rates of poverty and a high rate of inequities with regard to health, they often say that they feel like this. And what it says is, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. And this is a Mexican proverb that I think is incredibly powerful and meaningful and useful. We've been able to use this to have real conversations in communities because this is how people feel. They often feel buried. And it's critical that we address that if we expect to engage them. So here's what I think. I think that in America, we are in a state of culture war, plural. I think there are many different culture wars going on, and they're important. We've seen a lot of them emerge over the past couple of years. They certainly didn't start 2 years ago or 3 years ago. They started 400 years ago, plus, right? So all we're seeing is the continuation of that journey. It's just that it shows up differently. So for us right now, it shows up via hashtags. Hashtags that say all sorts of things about who we are, what we're experiencing, and where we're headed. We've seen about family separation at the border. We've seen about conversations about fake news. We've seen about efforts to ban Muslims. We've seen about pipelines and treaties and rights and land. We've seen about young people coming together about gun violence. We've seen the emergence of these memes. Barbecue Becky, Permit Patty, ID Adam, Bull Patrol Paula, Wake Up Susie, and just yesterday, I saw another one, Corner Store Caroline. Did anybody see Corner Store Caroline yet? Okay. A woman in a bodega, white woman in a bodega, I think in New York, calls the police because a little black boy who's 9 with his backpack on and is in there with his mom and his little sister brushed up against her butt. She's calling the police saying that she was sexually assaulted by this 9-year-old schoolboy in the bodega. And she's telling them that she's a police officer. And she's ranting on the phone, telling them she's been sexually assaulted by this 9-year-old boy. He grabbed my butt. This is where we are in these things that we talk about, culture wars. And then there's Me Too. This is Tarana Burke. And if you don't know who she is the originator of the Me Too movement. That's often gotten lost in the conversations that we've been having in the media. And I always make sure that if I'm going to mention Me Too, that I show Tarana Burke, because it's her work. We might be related, and that might be the other reason why. Now with that, Me Too has come to a very critical juncture. When I show this, how do you feel? Just yell it out. How do you feel? Disgusting. Sick, angry, disgusted, mad, very angry, unsurprised. This hurt. This is another wound, trauma, and assault on our society. And it's important. It's important for the work that we're doing in communities when we talk about the business of equity. And when we talk about what it means to move forward from a wound, trauma, or assault of this nature, if we want to create spaces and opportunities to achieve good health. So the interesting thing is, for all the culture wars that happen, they take place in community, right? That's the reality. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a minute. Just trust me, close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Let it out. One more. Take a deep breath. Let it out. When you think of your community, what do you see? What do you see in your community? What do you hear? What are the sounds in your community? What does your community smell like first thing in the morning? Does it smell different than when you come home in the evening? Who's in your community? Who do you see? If you were to take a walk down the street, who's in your community? Who's not in your community? Who didn't you see? Who didn't you notice? What do you love about your community? I hope you can find something you love about your community. What would you change about your community? Now open your eyes. Communities throughout this country are in the midst of a very deep struggle, deep and meaningful struggle. I believe that we've lost our way because we're less connected than we've ever been, but we think we're connected because of these. Human connection and interdependence is critical to this thing that we call equity, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But then when you think about what communities go through, this is what one community went through, Philadelphia. Everybody familiar with this? What happened in Starbucks? So here's what I'm going to ask you. When Starbucks happened, now think about that, a point in time, I say when Starbucks happened, you know what I mean, right? It's a pretty important moment. What did you think? Not feel. What did you think? Yell it out for me. Cops are racist. Cops are racist? Employees are racist? Again. The normal? Say it again. Can't go anywhere. Not surprised. You know, for me, when I saw this, and when I saw Charlottesville, I thought, what must the world think about us? Because they see this. I just kept thinking, what does the world think about us when they see this? Now, what did you feel? What did you feel? Betrayed, angry, despair. What was the other one?
A little bit of hate.
A little bit of hate. That's important, and it's real. Because what people need to understand is that the way that people who have oppressed identities are experiencing this world right now, in particular right now, there's a bit of a crucible type situation going on. There's this rage thing that exists, and it's important, and it's real, because people are human, and that emotion is real. And so you've got to remember that and think about that as you engage with colleagues, with peers, and with people in your community. What does that mean to carry the burden of knowing that this is a possibility for your life? So here's the good thing. In the midst of Starbucks happening, they were there. Do you know who they are? Most people don't. These are superheroes in disguise. These are the two women who recorded the incident. One recorded, and the other one can be heard questioning the police officers advocating on behalf of the two young men. So here's the interesting part. Coming out of this, Starbucks said, here's what we need to do. We're stopping everything, and everybody's going to anti-bias training. And what do you think happened? What do you think? What's different? They got a little information. What else? Nothing? Next time? Say it again. Starbucks looks good. Say it again. Stocks went up. Do you think that there's a chance that an employee in a Starbucks could call the police on two young black men sitting in a Starbucks again just because they're present?
Yeah.
Right? So it didn't end it, not by any stretch of the imagination. So here's the thing. I believe that Starbucks thought that by doing this anti-bias training thing, beyond it being a really great PR move, that they were building this bridge towards equity. So a bridge is supposed to get us from one place to another, help us to navigate over a difficult space or where there isn't something to help carry us, right? And so in it, I believe that in America, we think that diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence are the bridge to get us to where we need to be. I actually believe diversity and inclusion and cultural competence are a bridge to nowhere. Here's why. We've actively been working in the United States for over 50 years on issues of diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence at a very high federal level, right? So public policy, and in terms of private action within institutions and organizations, we've got policies on the books. We've trained the hell out of people. I can't even imagine how much money we've spent on training. Seriously. Folk have put kids through college training people on how not to be ... Right? Are we equitable yet? Anybody? I don't think so. It's gotten worse. So, I don't know that it's gotten worse, but I think it may be more obvious. Right? That's it. Right. So 50, 60 years we've been walking from where we were, where racism and sexism and xenophobia and injustice manifested in different ways, and we've walked away from that. But we certainly have not gotten to where we need to be. So I'm a believer that equity is what we need in order to continue to complete the bridge. So you all know what diversity and inclusion are. I put it up because here's the interesting part. When it comes to language, there are a lot of things that we know. Like, I know what it is. But if somebody put me on the spot and said, tell me what it is, it gets complicated. It is very important for you to get your language together, folks. You are going to be pushing up against systems, institutions, policies, practices, norms, and culture that is going to push back. Your ability to communicate about these very important issues can be make or break for you in terms of being able to win over people who you will need, one way or another. So you have to figure out for yourself. I'm not telling you use this. I don't believe in the definition. I believe in you finding the language necessary for you to create the understanding. But it takes practice. Don't just assume that if you're put on the spot and somebody says to you, what's equity, that you'll just be able to spit it like lyrics. That's not how this works. It takes practice, right? The other thing is, I wouldn't go to Greece, tell a joke in Swahili, and wonder why people don't laugh. You have to speak to your audience, right? So that's why definitions in and of themselves don't work, but they're critically important for your work. So let me ask you something. In your coalitions or in your communities or where you work, by show of hands, how many of you have a working glossary that guides your work and communication? Look around. Okay. If you don't do anything else, no, there are going to be a few of these things I'm going to say, so let's just add it to the list. If you do not have a working glossary that you use with anybody who you call partner, you will fail. You're failing right now. You're failing to lead. You have a responsibility to establish a language that is accessible and useful. And one of the things that frustrates me to the depths of my soul is when people work in communities and use language and do not give that language to communities to be able to use it for themselves. It is unfair and it is unjust. So you have work to do on this language thing. Cultural competence. Did anybody else roll their eyes? I roll my eyes. I go into healthcare institutions and clinical settings all the time where they are supposed to be so culturally competent. Not so much. And especially when it comes to working with their own staff. It's alarming to see organizational culture that is toxic when it comes to these issues. And these are the very same folks who are working to provide some sort of care, some sort of support in our communities. So here's another thing that I want you to be aware of that is important. These issues around diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence don't mean the same thing to everyone. So let me ask you a question. First of all, how many of you would identify as being a baby boomer? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you would identify as being Gen X? Woo! Gen X. Oh, I know that's right. I know that's right. All right. How many of you are millennials? It's okay. We take you on anyway. Anybody from Gen Z? Oh, and if you haven't read about Gen Z, go read about them. They're interesting, and they're coming. So here's the interesting part. When you look at diversity and inclusion and you ask across generations how people think of it, this is how it plays out. Boomers and Gen X believe that it is a moral imperative But millennials think of it more as a business imperative. They believe that this comes out of the social justice movements that emerged in the 50s and the 60s, and that boomers and Gen Xers touched it in a more direct way, experienced it in a more direct way, and were closer to it. Whereas millennials, because of how they have experienced society in this post-MTV world that showed people more integrated and interacting with one another, and the cultural lines around things like music and food and famous people have gotten a bit more blurred, there was an openness and a recognition that diversity and inclusion are a good business strategy, interestingly enough. It's the idea that they make us bigger, faster, stronger, smarter, and better at doing what we do. So we've been investing in these things. And the question is, again, how are we doing? So here's the interesting part. There are more CEOs named John or David than there are women CEOs of the S&P 1500. Moral to the story. If you have a kid or a grandkid, push for them to be named John or David. It will increase the odds that they will be a CEO, right? But then, let's take it a step further. What's the likelihood that you will see a woman who is a person of color and a CEO? It's the same odds of you going out and seeing one of those in the hallway. It just doesn't happen, right? That's the world that we live in. But haven't we spent trillions of dollars for 50 or 60 years on diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence? Haven't we broken barriers to education and created access for people to come into these corporate pipelines? Then why are we not seeing the unicorns? So, Fortune 500 companies that include sex orientation protections in 1996, 4%, that sucked. Go forward to 2017, 92%, woohoo, yay us. So then the question becomes, what's the number of openly gay Fortune 500 plus CEOs? How many? Guess. Actually, there are 3. Now, what do we know from the data about how reflective this is of the population? It's not, right? Not by any stretch of the imagination. We have work to do. And this shows you that policy is not enough. So, going to stop for a minute to address something really quick. It's a slight turn off of the road here, but I have to do this. So one of the things that I decided was, how could I use my privilege every time that I talk to a group? So one of the commitments that I made in 2018 was that every time that I talked to people, I was going to take a commercial break. And I was going to talk about something that was relevant to the LGBTQIA community, because I'm not a part of that community. And as a heterosexual, cisgender person, I have a privilege that they don't. And so in an effort to do something very tiny, not even a grain of sand worthy, I want to share this with you as a tool. How many of you are familiar with this? Raise your hands. Maybe about 40%. That's pretty good. Better than most groups, actually. If you haven't seen it before, go get it. Google it. Look at it for yourself. Talk to a family member about it. Bring it into your organization or institution. Because if we want to begin to talk about, advocate for, or even respect the issues of people who are part of the LGBTQIA community, we have to have a language to do that. And if we don't have a language, we don't have the conversation. Fair enough? All right, so now we're going to get back to the other stuff, okay? Here's the really tough message here. You can be, and I'm going to let you read it and just think your way through. You get it? So here's the thing. To be diverse but not inclusive is terrible. Because what it means is that you bring people in as window dressing. You bring them in so that you can count them. Like how people, they say bean counters, you know, they want to be able to count. Oh, we've got 6 of those and 8 of them and 2 of those, and we need to go get about 12 of them. Right? That's all it is. So then what you do is you bring in people who increase the diversity of a place, but then you tell them, we're not going to include you. You don't get to, I know, you don't get to be a part of the situation. You don't get to be a part of the decision making. You don't get the information. You don't get to be in the room, but you're here, right? Then it's easy to be inclusive, but not diverse. So when everybody is just like me, then the conversation flow. We like people who are like us, right? Not a whole lot of explaining to do or anything like that. That's not good either. You can be diverse and inclusive and not equitable. Think back to the slides that I'm showing you about the corporate CEOs, right? Because those are companies that for the most part are diverse and inclusive, but they have yet to get to the point of being equitable. And why? Because equity is about power. So I'm going to talk about that. So people will say, well, Common Health Action is a public health organization. Why do you talk about it as equity, diversity, and inclusion and not health equity? Why don't you just say health equity? Well, first of all, before I go any further, just to be clear, because I'm about making sure folks understand things, health equity, attainment of the highest level of health for all people. Pretty simple. Would everybody feel comfortable that they have a definition for health equity? And if you don't, it's fine, but do you feel comfortable that you have your own definition that you could tell somebody on the spot for health equity? Yes? Most of you? Not everybody looks confident. And I'm serious about this. So if you're not, it's okay, but it wouldn't be okay if we're in this room a month from now and you haven't gotten confident about it yet. Fair? All right. So why not health equity? Here's why. When I walk into rooms where people don't do public health, when health is not their business, and I say health equity, I get nothing. I'm talking about blank stare, deer in the headlights. I have no idea what you're talking about. And often the response is, we don't do health. And then I have to do the work to get them to understand that this thing that we call health is a production, and that they are a part of that production. Whether that's through action or inaction, the fact that they exist means that they play a role in the production of the public's health. And we need to help them figure out whatever that role is, even if it means getting out of the way. So I talked about this thing with language, and I want to go even further. This has been one of the things, and I heard somebody mention it, that's been very disturbing for me. The continual conflation of health disparity and health inequity. They are not the same thing. I have gone to schools of public health and had deans stand up and talk about health disparities when they should have been saying health inequities. So the health disparity is merely the difference in health status and outcomes between different groups of people, right? Everybody gets that. But the health inequity is different. It's the disparity that exists that's avoidable, it's preventable, it's unjust. So why would it be important to differentiate between the disparity or the inequity? Can anybody just tell me why is it important to differentiate? So here's the thing. The disparity in and of itself is not a bad thing. But when it is bad is that it's a disparity that exists because of injustice. That's on our watch. So when we keep calling things disparities, it's as though there's no catalyst for that. There's no responsibility for that. If you can't name a problem, you can't solve a problem, right? The problem is not the disparity. The problem is the inequity. And the reason is because there is injustice. So the second thing, if you don't do anything else today, or maybe this is the fifth thing because I'm on a roll, please, if you mean health inequity, say health inequity. If you mean health disparity, say health disparity. And again, practice is what's going to help you to make sure that you say it correctly. So, equity, understanding equity. I know everybody's seen the thing with the kids and the fence, and should there be a fence and no fence, and the boxes, and who moves the boxes, and who got the box, who built the box, and the whole 9 yards, right? So we're all familiar with the whole thing. What I want to do is to give you an example that you can use, because I think you probably understand the difference between equality and equity, but to be able to explain it to somebody else is where it gets important, right? So, how many of you are runners? Show-offs. How many of you maybe used to run? All right. Okay, so how many of you maybe you have kids? You have kids who run track? Anybody seen a track on television? That'd be me, right? Okay. If you're running a straight race, they say like a 40 or 100. I know that much, right? How do you line up? Shoulder to shoulder, right? You line up shoulder to shoulder because on any given day, based on training, your natural ability and effort, everybody then would have an equal opportunity to win the race. And in that instance, equality and equity are the same thing. Now, what happens when you run a full distance around the track, which I know is a 400, see? Now I'm showing off, right? How do you line up? Why do you stagger the start? Because the outside's bigger. And what does that mean? The inside? Hence the term inside track, right? So we stagger the start so that everybody has an equitable opportunity to win the race, okay? So when you're trying to explain the difference between equality and equity, I found that this is a fairly simple one that you can use. Could you pick it apart? Yes, and I see some people in the room who are going to start to go, you get what I mean, right? If you're doing a basic explanation, it's one that works. So, here's the other piece. Equity requires us to give all people fair opportunities to achieve their full potential. When I say this, what's the word that jumps out to folks? Fair. When I say fair, people say, that doesn't work. It's subjective. You can't measure it. You can't put your finger on it. So I've had to figure out, what does it mean to explain fair? What is fair? So fair, and this is the way I've taken to explaining it, fair is not what I think it is. It's not what you think it is. Fair is whatever is necessary to get a people, a population, or a community to their best possible outcome. That's what is fair. Every single time. If you are about the business of equity, it is whatever is necessary to get a person, a population, or a community to the best possible outcome. So here's the good news. Human beings are hardwired for fairness. Now, I know it may not feel like it, but the brain scientists who are way smarter than me have published on this, all right? And they believe that because of the interdependence of early humans, survival was dependent upon one another, right? We had to depend upon one another. And they believed that inequity could lead to death. So the idea being, say you were our hunter, and your cave was particularly cold. There was a housing inequity situation. You died. If you died and you weren't hunting anymore, we were hungry. So we wanted to make sure that your cave was okay. Make sense? Right? So they actually believe that our brains hardwired differently. And our brains actually light up when they test it with regard to equity. So that's the great news. So then why are we such a hot mess? Why are we in these culture wars? What is going on?
That's not fair, Dad. I go, life's not fair.
And that can be very true. Well, here's part of why life's not fair, right? 1 versus 3. So we have this part of us that's about the business of equity, but we have 3 things that are actively working against it. So 1 is unconscious bias. And the way that I like to think of unconscious bias is that it's like the soundtrack of our minds. Have you ever been in Marshall's or the elevator or the dentist's office and there's some music playing, you don't even know that it's playing, but you're tapping your finger, tapping your foot, humming, you don't even know what this song is. But in some way or other, you are reacting or responding to something that you don't even know is really going on. That's what unconscious bias is. It's the soundtrack of our mind. And we're humming and singing and dancing to it in real time, whether we recognize it or not. The second one is in-group bias. Everybody wants to be Batman, right? I like people who are like me. Anybody else in here 5'2"? Raise your hand. This is what I'm saying. You all are my people. We could talk about things, right? We like people who are like us. We have similar experiences, and we feel things the same way often, and we believe things in the same way. So it makes a lot of sense that we would like people who are like us. The third one is prejudice. Prejudice is not a bad thing. Prejudice in and of itself is a very human thing. In the absence of information, we fill in the blanks with data in a way that is about keeping us safe. So if I'm walking down an alley and I see 3 people walking towards me, I'm by myself. Maybe they're 3 men and they look a little big. Maybe I get on my cell phone and say I'm in alley X, and if you don't hear from me in 4 minutes, call somebody, right? And I've already prejudged this to be a dangerous situation. But then as the 3 men come into the light, I see maybe they're a priest, an imam, and I don't know, maybe a teacher, right? And so there was no threat there, but I filled in the blank to prepare myself to be safe. Prejudice is to prejudge. In and of itself, it is not a bad thing. When it becomes a bad thing, any of these three is this: power. Power is the ability to define reality for ourselves and for others. And a lot of this work that we do in this space about diversity and inclusion misses the mark because it fails to address the issue of power. That's why these organizations, that's why communities, that's why even from a policy perspective, we often fail to hit the mark with regard to equity. So I'm going to show you a few examples. Here's one. Read that. What's wrong with it? Slaves were not workers. You said, was that a statement by Kanye? I may quote you on that. Right? Workers. What does workers imply? They were paid. It was voluntary. Somebody submitted a resume. I don't know. They could quit, right? Now let me ask you the other thing. Who did it? Who did it? What's the slave trade? People did it, didn't they? But it fails to mention that. This was a mom, Ronnie, and her son, Kobe. Kobe was doing his homework. Ronnie saw it and, of course, lost her mind. And it was like, you got to be kidding me. Put it on Facebook. It caused a great hubbub. And McGraw-Hill, and I'm sure many of you remember McGraw-Hill from your textbooks, sent a sticker out to put over it to correct the situation. Real world Band-Aid solution. The point is, this was in a textbook, right? Textbooks are an important thing when it comes to power, so stay tuned. Here's another one. In Texas again, I'm not picking on Texas like that, but I'm just saying, in Texas again. Do you all know that there was, let me go back real quick. Do you know that there was a huge thing about having a Mexican-American heritage studies curriculum in the state of Texas? They have been trying for decades. Sidebar, that's some foolishness. Coming back in. So this is the textbook that they put together for this. In the textbook, this is what it says. So I'm going to help break it down for you. The title is Ethnic Hostility. And it says, stereotypically, Mexicans were viewed as lazy compared to European or American workers. Industrialists were very driven, competitive men who were always on the clock and continually concerned with efficiency. They were used to their workers putting in a full day's work quietly and obediently and respecting rules, authority, and property. In contrast, Mexican laborers were not reared to put in a full day's work so vigorously. There was a cultural attitude of mañana or tomorrow when it came to high gear production. It was also traditional to skip work on Mondays, and drinking on the job could be a problem. Power is the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. What does it do for young people in high school to believe that slavery was about workers who were brought here by something, not people? What does it mean to have a Mexican-American studies course in Texas that has this language in a textbook? What does it mean? What does it do? What perception does it create? And can you imagine for Mexican-American kids that this is what they are learning about their heritage in school? I'm not even talking about all the other kids. That's the insidious nature. That's power. Last one. And this one comes from healthcare. It's actually kind of remarkable, but anyway, nursing, a concept-based approach to learning. And it says, Jews may be vocal and demand assistance. Blacks often report higher pain intensity than other cultures. And I'll circle back to that. Hispanics may believe that pain is a form of punishment and that suffering must be endured if they are to enter heaven. Native Americans may prefer to receive medications that have been blessed by a tribal shaman. Everybody, seriously. This was in a nursing textbook. What do you think this does? And we're talking about culturally competent care? This is about more than that. This is about how do we choose to be in relationship with one another. Power is the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. So this is a bit of an equation. If you take prejudice, unconscious bias, or in-group bias, and put it with power, and power comes through in our decisions, behaviors, and actions, that's when you end up with isms. And this is what we spend a lot of our time talking about. Isms are about systems of privilege and oppression. based on social identities. Some social identities we are born with. Biological sex would be one. Some of them we can acquire over the course of a lifetime. A college education would be an idea of an identity, to be college educated, that factors into privilege and oppression. And some of them happen over time. So according to employment law, elders have protection. According to employment law, you're an elder when you turn 40. How you feeling? How you feeling? I know how I felt. I got in my feelings when I found that out. Elder, right? But the idea is, and also with regard to disabilities, those are things that can happen over the course of a lifetime. Your identities can change. And they're rooted in beliefs of superiority and inferiority. Somebody is better and somebody is less than. So this is why it's so important. Privilege and oppression are about the value that society places on each of us based on our social identities. That value creates the context for our lives that determines whether we ever have the opportunity to be healthy. Does everybody get that? Now here's the good news in a sense. Values change. Values change. So there's opportunity here. Everything is not lost. So here's how I encourage you to talk about privilege and oppression. Privilege is like walking up an up escalator. What happens if you stop walking? There's still a force that's doing this, that's helping you up. Oppression is like walking up a down escalator. What happens if you stop walking? You go back down, right? You're expending extra energy to get up all the time. That's how the forces of privilege and oppression work in relation to the identities that we have. So here's the thing. Privilege is not all that it's cracked up to be. Privilege is actually killing the privileged. In fact, white privilege is killing white people. So when we look at the data, white, non-Hispanic midlife mortality from deaths of despair, which is around alcohol, drug use, and suicide, look at the red lines. Look at what's happening, right? So there's this new thing that's emerging that working class white Americans are now dying in middle age at faster rates than minority groups. It's created a big hubbub, hasn't it? Specifically about this. Opioids. So now we have a national emergency and a national crisis about opioids because white people are dying. And that's real talk. Now I'm going to take it a step further, and this is going to make people uncomfortable, but it's real talk. If you look in the academic literature, perceptions of pain on the part of clinicians when they're dealing with patients, if they're dealing with a black patient, and they will generally believe, number one, that black people can tolerate more pain. Number two, that when asked to rate their pain on a scale from 1 to 10, that black people are overstating their pain when they give their rating. Number three, that black people are more likely to become addicted. And number four, that a black person is more likely to use their opioid prescription for a nefarious purpose. On the flip side, there's a belief that white people cannot tolerate pain. When asked to rate their pain on a scale from 1 to 10, that they are understating their pain, they are less likely to become addicted, and they are less likely to use their prescription for a nefarious purpose. Given the economic downturn, given the fact that people were moving into jobs that were requiring manual labor where they weren't necessarily doing that before, given a lot of different conditions with regard to pharmaceutical companies pushing opioid prescriptions, we then ended up with the perfect storm. We had clinicians who were willing to do anything to avoid white pain and who really didn't care as much about avoiding black pain. So for the first time that I can put together in my mind, racism actually acted as a protective factor for black people when it came to health outcomes. Everybody stop and think about it. I am dead serious. And that is some foolishness. That shows you how privilege could actually kill the privileged. It's not all that it's cracked up to be. Privilege isolates us from one another. It prevents us from being in relationship with one another. It prevents us from having a full human experience. Oh, and it feels good while it's happening. It feels good. But you know what it's like? How many of you all grew up with a black and white TV? Tell the truth. Okay. Then color TVs came in, right? You can see the game or you can see the movie or the show, whether you're watching a black and white or color with Dolby and surround sound, but the experience is very different. Privilege sets you up for a black and white existence. What it doesn't do is allow you to live a life of full color. And I'm pushing on this because I want you to begin to think about how privilege manifests in your own lives. Each of us has at least one privileged identity. I'm willing to bet on it. So the question is, what does that do to your ability to bring equity forward in communities and in the work that you're doing? Is your privilege in your way? How does it factor into your relationships? On the flip side, no shock, oppression is killing the oppressed. And we know that some of this comes from chronic stress. Remember I said that power is the ability to define reality for yourself or for others. Oppression and the very nature of oppressed identities means that you cannot define reality for yourself on a daily basis. So if you come from a class, let's say that you are living in poverty, right? That inability to have power to make decisions that are financial in nature robs you of your power every single day. It creates chronic stress that leads to something that we talk about as allostatic load. And allostatic load is at a cellular level. This stuff, this persistent chronic stress, tears you apart. Now the epigeneticists, and I said it correctly, I'm having a me moment because there's always a struggle on that one. These are really smart folks who know that genes are sitting there in your body like light switches, and all they need is for something to flick on a switch. Well, it turns out that stress flicks the switch on a lot of things, and that's what we see happening with chronic disease in communities of color. So when you take this and you look at it with regard to maternal mortality specifically, this actually pisses me off. I saw this, and the day that I saw it, I actually got angry. And I was surprised because when I look at data, I don't normally just get angry. I got angry. This is unacceptable. The United States of America, look at what is happening with maternal mortality. Aren't we the best, the biggest, and the baddest at everything? What is this about? What are we not valuing here? Who are we not valuing here? And why is this happening in this way? Here's what makes it even worse. Look at pregnancy-related deaths by race. And look at Native and Black women. We can't live like this, literally and figuratively. We have work to do. So it's interesting because how many of you are familiar with Serena Williams' birth story? Okay, not enough. When Serena had Olympia, they had to do surgery. And if you don't know, Serena has a history of blood clots. After the surgery, she was in the room with her mom, and she was struggling to breathe like I've been doing since I got here, right? She didn't want her mom to know, so she got up and walked to the nurse's station herself and said, "Nurse, I can't breathe." Nurse said, "Oh, it's probably just the after effects, the anesthesia and everything. Go on back and lay down, you'll be fine." And she said, No, I can't breathe. And the nurse said, "No, I'm sure there's nothing really wrong. Just go on ahead." She said, "No, I can't breathe. I have a history of blood clots, and I need for you to check me." And so she pushed and pushed, and they said, they would go ahead and do the ultrasound. And they didn't find anything. And she said, "You need to do Doppler." She said, "You need to do Doppler." The patient, the Black woman, one of the most famous people in the whole entire world, had to push to get them to do the Doppler. And when they did the Doppler, what did they find out? She had blood clots. My question is, how many times do Black women, Black people, people of color, people living in poverty in this country need to say, "I can't breathe"? Serena said it, and nobody heard her. Eric Garner said it. People have been saying it over and over again in different ways. Remember the image I showed in the beginning that said they tried to bury us, right? It's that feeling of being buried that you can't breathe. Our social structure and condition right now, the inequities that we experience, do not lend themselves to people being able to breathe on a most basic level. And if we are about the business of health, we have no choice but to address these things in a very real way. So how do we move from culture war to culture change? We're a country that is very divided. There's no doubt about that. I think we all see it and feel it in many different ways. But I believe that there are opportunities. So the first part is to understand what culture is, and those are those things that we have in common, our values, our beliefs, our shared traditions, our norms, the places where we intersect and we share things. That's what culture is really about. In public health, we've been successful at shifting culture, and we've been successful in shifting the culture of smoking. This is the place. This is the example. So take a look at the ads where you see a famous athlete, Willie Mays, saying that Chesterfield cigarettes are great and the best for you. You've got a little boy saying, I remember Mama and Papa on Mother's Day and Father's Day with a carton of cigarettes. I'm trying to imagine if I actually did that, by the way. Happy Mother's Day with a carton of cigarettes, right? Doctors smoke Camels, and women are superior to men because of Virginia Slims. That was the culture of smoking. This is the culture of smoking. Right? This is what we've done. This is how we've shifted. This is how we start to see smoking rates drop. But the reality is, culture changes all the time. There are threats to culture all the time. So the smoking thing, we haven't conquered this yet by any stretch of the imagination. The introduction of e-cigs and hookah have now created another challenge for public health in terms of keeping this as being the culture of smoking. So how do you go about changing culture? A big piece of it is perspective transformation. I put the definition because I have to put the definition, but I'm going to explain it to you because hopefully it will make more sense. It's an adult learning theory, and what it says basically is when you know, think, and believe something different, you will decide, behave, and act differently. You will be compelled to do something different in the world. You ever have one of those situations where you say you can't unsee something? You can't unknow it? Once you know, it's always there with you, right? It's that idea, but it's not just that. And it's because of that, you actually do something different. So with regard to these issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion, privilege and oppression, all of the isms that we see, we're looking to create perspective transformation, and how you do that is through head and heart. So this is the big mistake that we've made in public health. This is the big mistake that we've made in social justice work for a very long time. Often, the idea is the people united will not be defeated. It's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do. And that should be enough. And if I tell you that, you need to be on board. You need to change the policy because it's the right thing to do. How's that working out for us? Not so much. On the flip side, I've worked with health departments who have tried to go this route of equity and tried to do it purely from the standpoint, dollars, data, facts, information, that's it. And if I tell you and I can show you the numbers, that should be compelling enough for you to change the policy, change the practice, change the program, change the behavior, change the decision. And guess what? That's not how human beings work. So for the work that you are trying to do, you have to engage in perspective transformation work, and you must engage head and heart. That's why this piece about data becomes critical. The data are important, and your ability to translate those data into the communities with whom you work is critical. Sharing the data, creating transparency around the data, creating straight sight lines for them to be engaged as a part of that process is critically important. On the flip side, having the conversation about justice and fairness and meaning is also critical. When you create perspective transformation, the idea is that you develop an equity lens. The equity lens is the lens through which you view the world to understand who experiences the benefit and who experiences the burden of a policy, program, or practice. Note, I did not say who receives the benefit or who receives the burden. If I say receive benefit, what happens to the person I'm speaking with? What happens? Where do they go automatically? Receive benefit. Welfare. They're thinking about a social program. That's not what this is about. This is about how people experience the world. So here's the other piece, and this is the push for people who are engaged in systems change work, institutional change work, cultural change work. I don't care about your intentions. Your intentions are neither here nor there. What I care about is your impact. okay? And what you're not going to do is to live on the goodness of your intentions. Those days are over. We have done a lot of that. Like-minded people who are well-intended and about the business of humanity are great at backslapping each other and giving one another awards. But when you look at the data, have the data changed? The answer is no, then nobody gets an award. This is not about intent anymore. This is about impact. So if we want to get to this place that is about equity, diversity, and inclusion, it starts with you. Often, for people who are in the business of help and helping, this can be an uncomfortable conversation and realization. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you to do, if you have not done it yet, is to take the implicit association test. How many of you have taken it? Many of you, but not all of you. And if you have taken it, take it again periodically, because it actually changes. The things that you experience can actually change your bias. You can't do anything to stop your bias if you don't know you have it, right? So it's important to hold a mirror up to see who you really are. Forgive yourself in advance. You cannot swim in dirty water and expect to be clean. We are products of 400 plus years of history, right? So our bias is very understandable. But what's not understandable is if we don't take the test and we don't tend to it. Fair enough? Now in that, there are some things that you need to do and to think about. I have a lot of folks who think that they're experts in equity. I don't think I'm an expert in equity. I evangelize about it, but I'm not an expert in it. This is a journey, and I got stuff, right? Anybody else got stuff? When it comes to this whole equity thing and identities thing and bias thing and all of that, and power dynamic, I got stuff. And if you can't admit that you have stuff, you have a lot more work to do. It's okay to say that you have stuff. It's not supposed to be comfortable, but it's real. Beyond you, you have to begin to do the work within your organizations. And you have to institutionalize this work. That means the sooner that you can bring the language in, the sooner that you can put it into policy, the better. The sooner that you can start to communicate externally is the sooner that you can hold your institution or your organization hostage to do the work. I did just say hold them hostage. Once you announce this to the community and you put it into the universe, it gets a lot harder for leadership to back away from it. If you keep it quiet, it gets a lot easier for a budget line item to get crossed out, a position to be phased out, a program to be eliminated. Does everybody get what I mean by that? Visibility leads to credibility, leads to sustainability. Institutionalizing something is not just about having a policy on the books. It's about bringing it into the culture of an organization. If you haven't made the investment and you have the power within your organization, institution, or community, training is critical. Good intentions are not good enough. I do this work every single day, and I still have stuff. You have to make the investment in your own development. And you have to be humble enough to recognize that you should be in a state of continuous learning. You will never, ever fully master this. And if you think that you have, you will become a danger to the work. Community. Everything that you know about this, the community should know too. You can't hold information hostage, right? There are ways for you to bring this into community and also to connect it in ways to social determinants of health so that they too can understand that your health is not an accident, but it's a production of society. When you fail to do that, you fail to lead. An example that I would give you, and I would say check it out when you get a chance, is HIP Cuyahoga, the Health Improvement Partnership in Cuyahoga County. I've been working with them, we've been working with them for the better part of a decade. And what I will tell you is that they had gotten into their community health improvement process, and they had around 60 organizations as a part of this. They had identified 14 strategies and were at a point where they knew they were either going to implode or explode because they could not reach agreement on 3. They asked us to come in and put together a process and to move them from 14 to 3. But people were very dug in. And many of them were dug in on things that were considered very downstream. In fact, it wasn't just that they were talking about healthy eating, active living, for instance. They were talking at a very programmatic level about healthy eating, active living, and not at a policy level. And so they knew that we had to push the conversation to see if we could get folks upstream, make sure everybody felt heard, and get them down to 3. We spent a day with them, and surprisingly, got them down to 4. I didn't know that I really expected that to happen. The 4th one was to eliminate racism as a social determinant of health in the place where Tamir Rice was murdered. And I said murdered because I meant it. So in that, understanding they had identified this, they said, then what do we do about that? How do we begin to eliminate racism? What I will tell you about the leadership in Cuyahoga County is this. They have taken some of the biggest risks I've ever seen in a jurisdiction. They have stayed the course longer than anybody I have seen in doing this work in a way that I have not seen anywhere else. They've made the investment to train workforce at the health department, but not only that. They trained leadership from all 60-some-odd organizations. They worked with other partners and now have made it so that the general population, the community, is having access to undoing racism training, REI training, all different types of equity-focused and based training. They've gone all in. If you want to see systems and institutions change, that's the level of investment that you will need to make to be able to see ROI in a short period of time. And even when I say short, I'm probably talking about 10 years. That's what I'm saying. So Cuyahoga County is one that I would encourage you to take a look at their work. They have an amazing video that you can use that helps to explain social determinants of health, by the way. With infographics, they did a phenomenal job based on their work over time, and I think it's a tool that you all could also use in your own communities. So in order for you to lead, it's important that you have language. And so in that, it's important to note, and Robin Williams said, no matter what people tell you, words and ideas can change the world. I don't know that I realized how important this was until I started to research it. And in their book, Words Can Change Your Mind, Andrew Newberg and Mark Waldman wrote, a single word has the power to influence the expression of genes that regulate physical and emotional stress. A word can actually do that to somebody. A word can actually make somebody sick. So now I want to push on that a little bit. We have a problem in public health in particular. We have a word problem. We engage regularly in the language of oppression, and we need to stop. And so some of you may get in your feelings about some of the things that I'm about to say, and you may get uncomfortable, drop your shoulders, and it's going to be okay. I just want to remind you of that, because it's important, because I didn't realize before how much words mean to people, right? How many of you use the word vulnerable to describe populations, people, etc.? Raise your hands, it's okay. All right, it's very common. When I say the word vulnerable, what's the first word that comes to mind? We did a project about veterans' mental health, and they wanted us to call them vulnerable veterans. And I kept telling the funder, not on my watch. They kept saying, call them vulnerable veterans, and I kept saying, not on my watch. Do you know we had to do focus groups to prove to them that we could not use that language? And when we sat with veterans and talked to them, and we used the word vulnerable, they were so insulted, and they were angry, because they immediately went to the word weak. When we walk into communities and we tell them you are part of a vulnerable population, or this is a vulnerable community, what do you think you are putting on to that community? What is their self-perception? So then people say, well, if we don't call them vulnerable, what do we call them? How about you say that they experience social, economic, emotional, psychological, physical, financial vulnerability. They experience vulnerability, but you do not label them as vulnerable. People interpret that as a character assessment, and we need to stop it. So again, I'll say, if the word vulnerable is important to you, transform it into vulnerability and talk about the fact that people experience vulnerability when they engage with systems and institutions that were not designed with them in mind, or in fact were not designed to support them, or in fact were designed actually to do things like incarcerate them and keep them uneducated. Everybody get that one on vulnerability and vulnerable? Okay. The next one. How many of you say empower? Raise your hands. And I know because I've heard it since I've been here. Here's the problem with empower. When we say we empower communities or we empower people, it makes it sound like I go around with a magic wand and say, you get power and you have power and here's a little power for you. Who am I to do that? How disrespectful and condescending is it to tell people that their power comes from me? That's ridiculous. Stop it. You don't empower anybody, unless maybe if you gave birth to them, and that's a whole other issue, right? What we do is that we help people in communities identify their power, harness their power, and use their power. But what we don't do is empower them. The next one, this is an oldie but a goodie. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Underserved has a specific definition. But what we've done is to take it and make it into an umbrella for all kinds of things, right? We don't need to do that. It has a very specific definition, and we're missing what we should be talking about. Communities are not underserved. They're under-resourced. They're only underserved if you're speaking specifically about services. When we keep calling communities underserved, when they are supposed to advocate on their own behalf, what's their attention hyper-focused on? Services. When we talk about a community as being underserved, it makes it sound like they are standing there saying, hello, governor, may I have another? How is that right? They're under-resourced, and within the context of being under-resourced, they can be underserved. Maybe they're under-resourced because they don't have money, or leadership, or a built environment to support healthy eating and active living, right? Do you all get what I'm saying and what the difference is there? Stop conflating the language on that. Let's say under-resourced when we can, and when we're saying underserved, make sure it's about services. How many of you say non-white? Thank goodness. Why don't you say it? Somebody? That's it. So what it's actually doing is it's centering whiteness. It reinforces the white identity as being the center of everything, and it otherizes everybody else. It says that in some way, anyone else is a derivative, a variation of whiteness. Does that make sense, everybody? And if you want to know why this is so toxic, and I encourage you to call people on it. If you see it in a report, if someone says it, do it in whatever way that you need to do it, but call people on it. Because when you call someone non-white, not only are you centering whiteness and the supremacy of whiteness and otherizing people, this is the favorite language of Nazis, neo-Nazis, skinheads, racists, and really the bottom of society. If you go online and you search the hashtag non-white, you will know exactly what I mean. It is not language with which we would want to associate ourselves, our research, our publications, or anything else. The last one is the community. We all say this. So I'm not saying don't say it. But what I am saying is say it with an awareness. When you say the community, it is very much like saying those people. Does it irritate anybody else when people say those people? It's the same thing as saying the community. Now, if you work in an institution, in an organization, and you can't say our community, you have work to do. Now, let me be clear. I am not telling you to go home and start saying our community so that people can throw shade and cast a side eye at you like, have you lost your mind? Right? So, here's a question. How many of you live in the same zip code as the work of this grant? It's about less than half. So this gets difficult, right? Because if you are working in a place where you don't live, can you ever say our community and have legitimacy in doing it? I've seen it happen. When you are able to be in relationship like that, you are firing on all cylinders. There have been communities in this country where I have been able to walk in after having worked there for a long period of time, built trust, invested, and it was not my zip code. And I could say our community because the community gave that to me. Do you get what I mean when I say that? They said you are part of this community, right? When we say the community, there is an us and them dynamic that we are creating that actually works against what we're trying to do with regard to health equity. So I encourage you, I'm not saying go home and start saying our community, because trust me, you will get called out. But work to a place that you could actually say it and stand in it. And maybe it never happens, but that should actually be your intent. So what to ask a room of grantees at a grantee kickoff? One is, I'm going to ask you to look in the mirror, and I want you to look for your superpower. And in that, a hint is that it's your privilege. Every single one of us has privileged identities, and it serves as the greatest opportunity for us to influence change. It's funny because we need to use our superpowers for good and not evil. How many of you saw the movie Black Panther? So these are the Dora Milaje. They were badass. Coming and going, right? So when I think about the Dora Milaje, and I went in and I said, what are the characteristics of them? They work together, work independently, they protect and support, they're bodyguards and they guard bodies. They're trained and skilled, they're powerful contributors, they're reliable, they're different than their counterparts, they support the community, they're equitable partners, they have a work ethic and they're action-oriented. Wouldn't you want to be the Dora Milaje of public health? Isn't that who you want to be? So with that, I want to ask you to use your privilege as a weapon and not a tool. I think privilege is a lot like a hammer. And at any given moment, we can use it in one way or another, regardless of what it was intended to be used for. Privilege very much functions in the same way, but here's the challenge. People who are in helping professions have savior mentality, whether we realize it or not. And we need to stop. Because if we believe that we are required in order for people to be saved, we will always work in a way that the power dynamic is inequitable. Make sense, everybody? So what I'm asking you to do is not to say that you serve communities, but that you work with communities. It is a different mentality and a different dynamic. I'm not necessarily asking you to be the superhero, but I'm asking you to use your superpowers. There's a difference. The Dora Milaje were not the superhero, but they did have superpowers. This stuff is important and it's hard. And a lot of times I think we miss the opportunity to do what we should do. So we have courage and we have bravery. And I believe that courage is about responding to a threat. It's the mom who lifts the SUV off the 3-year-old. It's the person who jumps in front of a bullet. I think that's courageous, right? But I think bravery is something different. I think to be brave is to take a risk that you don't have to take, but that you cannot imagine the world if you didn't. That's what I'm asking you to do as you do this work that is about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Leverage your privilege to have the hardest conversations of your life. Stop hyper-focusing on those people and the community, because a lot of times the change that you need is much closer to you. Some of the conversations that we avoid having are with the people who are most like us, because it's a lot easier to go to talk to people who are not like us. Because when we talk to people who are like us, we see ourselves. To be very specific and very clear, 2 identities in particular that I'm going to lift up. For white folks in the room, start thinking about and talking to other white folks. If you want to see equity happen, that's where your conversations need to be right now. With regard to men and women, men, go get your guys. There are conversations that you need to have. Women will be on the front lines and will be fighting against the inequities that we see in society, and it's going to keep happening. But if men are not having conversations amongst themselves, the change that we hope to see in culture and in policy will not happen. So with that, I am done. It was a whole lot. I am going to stop right there, and thank you. I'm going to take about 5 minutes, does anybody have, and I'm going to phrase it like this, sure, question, but if you have a comment that there is something that resonated for you, maybe something on which you're stewing, a new idea, etc., are you willing to share? And if you are, Nafifa has a microphone. Anybody? A comment, something that is stewing for you or stands out for you?
I'll start by just saying I loved it. It was great. I was very excited and inspired. I think sometimes we sort of get bogged down in, like, what specifically do we say? How do we approach the conversation? So I really appreciated getting specific language, sort of tweaks and tools for us to use in our documents and our outreach. I just think it's really important work for us to be doing, and we spend a lot of time talking about it, and we talked about this yesterday, and I don't know, it's very emotional. I think we talk about it, and I want us to do it. So I think this gave us some tools to do that, and I appreciate it.
I'm glad for that, and I can understand why it's emotional. Sometimes I think if it's not emotional, I wonder if someone should actually be doing the work, right? Because again, it's head and heart work, and it's hard work, and it's work that means that we have to work on ourselves, and sometimes that's the hardest work in the world, right? So thank you. Somebody else? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thought it was a great presentation and lots of takeaways. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about fragility and privilege guilt and how to work through some of that.
So I think part of the reason that the opioid epidemic happened, in addition to clinicians' role and big pharma's role and opioids in general, has to do with a lack of resilience. And so what's emerging from the literature is that white privilege, in essence, creates that fragility. So the way that I would describe it is that how many of you, when you get in a body of water, can get on your back and you just float, that you're a floater? Okay. How many of you, when you get in a body of water, you sink? Yeah, I usually think of you all as being really lean, and I'm jealous. Okay, so here's the thing. Privilege is like lying on your back and looking up at a blue sky, and you just float. And it's just there for you. If somebody spends all their time on their back like that, what happens to their muscles? They atrophy. And now, what happens if a shark comes and they need to get away, right? Are they able to all of a sudden start to swim or tread water? Are they able to do that right away? No. Their muscles have atrophy. They're probably weak, uncoordinated, right? And so that's what they believe in terms of resilience has happened to white Americans over time. And that's why there's an inability to recover, adjust, and adapt. And in response to that, then, fragility can play out in a number of ways. People can respond to fragility with rage, right? But they can also respond to fragility by shutting down and moving into spaces around depression and so on and so forth. White fragility is real. Equity, I believe, is a tool to counteract it. And I believe that through greater equity in society, that fragility will start to drop. But white people need to realize that there is a value in letting go of white privilege. And that's the work and the conversation that we need to begin to have. Why should white people want to give up their privilege? There's actually value and benefit in it, and here's how. So that's part of the reason why I talk about the opioid piece as a description. The last part, on the flip side, people who sink, and I liken that to folks who have oppressed identities, when they get in the water, they spend all of their time treading water. Constantly. And even on the surface, if it doesn't look like they're treading, if you were to see underneath, they're working furiously to stay above water. What happens to someone who's constantly treading like that in society? Exhausted, wear and tear, right? And it creates a different type of vulnerability. So thank you for asking the question, but I think equity actually is the answer to that.